Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning in Korea, wherever you are. Hello, I'm saying hello. Greetings, sent from South Korea. Welcome to the new season of the New Music Symposium hosted by the Korean Cultural Society of Boston and sponsored by the Korean Consul General of Boston as well. My name is Taek-sil Kim. I'm a composer and I teach music at San Diego State University. And it is, like always, my privilege to serve as the curator and host of this symposium series. Normally, I would begin with saying, it is my pleasure to have so-and-so, but today I am also the speaker. And this is going to be my first and mostly almost the last time talking, but not about my music, but I'm going to talk about some first early Korean composers in the 20th centuries and their legacies and how they reacted to each other and their legacies in the next generation of composers, especially in the United States. Again, it is a great coincidence that I am doing this in the city of Tongyeong in South Korea, the hometown of Lee Sang-yoon, one of the composers I will present today. I'm here to visit the Tongyeong International Music Festival in its 20th season. And to be really honest, I am a little nervous, and this is almost my first time ever that I actually wrote script. I don't usually write scripts for any presentation, but this time I am a little nervous. However, I mean, it doesn't matter how much I am passionate about this topic and promoting music by my colleagues, wonderful colleagues. But just because I'm not an expert and I'm not music historian or musicologist, but I think it's still probably more beneficial to bring this to the table with some flaws possibly, and keep it rolling and invite others to chime in and grow more discussion from here. My talk today would be just a collection of my thoughts while I have served as the curator of this series. And I'd love to thank again the Korean Cultural Society of Boston for having worked with me so wonderfully and having me here, and Korean Consul General in Boston for your generous support. And I also thank you, all of you, for being with me now or in the future through the video. And I'd love to invite you as well to participate in this session by commenting, give us commenting or feedback, either on Zoom chat or on the Facebook in the Facebook comment. Though I might be a little slow in reacting to those, because normally I would be just a host or moderator, but today I am doing both speaking and moderating. Okay, so without further ado, here we go. So today's content is pretty simple. We will begin with the historical background. And then the main body of this lecture would be selected early Korean composers, wherever they had been. And we will end up with how it affected the legacy of the current atmosphere or current scene of Korean composers, especially in the States. Music had existed for a long time in the Korean Peninsula. In Samguk-sagi, written in 12th century, in Samguk-sagi, recorded in 12th century, it discussed the musicians, and musical instruments like gayagum, komungo, from Three Kingdoms period, dated from 1st century BC, from 7th century. And even before it, Chinese history book San Kuo-chi addresses the music and drama in the Rite of Gojoseon, dated before the 1st century BC. Of course, I'm not going to just go over all the history of music in Korean Peninsula. So the first juncture for us today to begin with is late 19th century, especially 1890s. So in 1890s, what happened in South Korea was there was non-Korean music, especially so-called Western music, imported or introduced in South Korea or Korea at that point. And one way that happened was through the hymnals that were edited by the missionaries. And this is one of the first hymnals in South Korea, titled Chanyanga, and then that was edited by a missionary named Underwood. And it has, as you can see, it has the Western notation you can find with the Korean text. Then that is dated 1894. And the missionaries also brought the portable organs and lots of singing music, vocal music, hymn singing tradition in South Korea. The Korean people or government voluntarily also organized some Western musical activity through military band. That's coincided with the emergence of the Korean Empire in 1897. And that's meaningful because it was done voluntarily by them. And they invited this director, Franz Eckert from Germany. He's circled here, you can see, and then enlarged on the right-hand side. And even though the military band was officially degraded and then dismissed later when Korea entered into the Japanese colonial period, but they existed until 1930 and as a private band and serving the audience, wider audience of Seoul. And also a lot of musicians who were trained through this military band became the music teachers in Seoul later. And also Franz Eckert, when he began his residency or directorship in 1901, he brought lots of Western instruments, especially woodwinds, brass, and percussion instruments. And some of the fruit or some of the trainees is Jung Sa-in, and he was the one who wrote first songs and as well as this first band piece in South Korea. And I was not able to get the score, but this is the piccolo part. And not related to music, but another important event around this time in South Korea is immigration to the States of Korean people. That the very first ones are dated in 1902/1903 because they left South Korea in 1902 and left to Hawaii, and then they arrived in 1903. And on, there were a wave of Korean people moving to mostly Hawaii, but some went to mainland America. It was that wave were interrupted by Japanese government several times, but still a lot of people settled down in Hawaii and West Coast. And during the colonial period, many of those who wanted to study Western music moved to Japan temporarily to study instruments or music theory. And then many of them returned. Some of them actually moved further in another country. And some of them began composing. So these are basically performer composers as opposed to composers, those who just indulged only into composition. And those include Ik-tae-an or Anik-tae, who firstly composed the current national anthem of Korea, and violinist/composer Nan-pa Hong, and also Jae Myung-hyun and Dong-sun Chae. We are going to listen to just a brief excerpt of Dong-sun Chae's song. I think that's good enough for us to get the gist of the music here. And afterwards, the first group of composers who focused more on composing include Se-hyung Kim, who studied in the States at Chapman University, and then who got a master's degree in music for the first time in South Korea at Western University, as I understand, in Canada. And he returned back to South Korea and taught at Seoul National University. And he also founded Korean Composers Association and became its first president for a long time. And on your right-hand side, Sunnam Kim is also a very prolific, very influential composer until in 1940s. So after the colonial period, he moved to North Korea. The next one we're going to talk about is Lee Sang-yoon, probably one of the first Korean artists who gained international attention and status. And he was, again, growing up in Dongyang. And he learned violin first, and he went to Japan as well, studying music, studying cello and music theory and composition, and came back to Korea and participated in independence movement. After Korean War, he moved to Seoul and taught at Seoul National University for a couple of years. And in 1955, he received the Seoul City Cultural Award, which allowed him to move to Europe to continue studying music. He landed first in France and then settled in Germany. In 1958, he began his career in Europe with having some premieres of his pieces, including one big one at the International Summer Courses of Contemporary Music in Darmstadt. It was the hot place among contemporary music musicians at the time, and then it's still going very strong nowadays. And many of his works incorporate the Korean traditional ceremonial or court music, as you can hear in this piece titled Reak or Yeak in Korean. You will see some Korean traditional musicians, but they are not playing. Their pictures were just inserted. So it's music for Western orchestra, basically. Okay, Yeak was premiered in 1966 in Donaueschingen, Germany. That's around when he lived in West Berlin. Also, that means there were West and East Berlins back then. And he was building his career with getting more and more performances of his music. But in 1967, 1 year after the premiere of Yeak, due to an alleged act of espionage, he was brought back to South Korea and imprisoned. Approximately 200 artists from all around the world, including Karajan and Stravinsky, signed the petition against that, and Yoon was eventually released in 1969 and returned to Germany, and he became a German citizen. And he taught in Hanover and West Berlin until 1985. And he was not able to, or he didn't come back to South Korea afterwards. Okay, let's move to the States now. So 3 years after Lee Sang-yoon was born, Earl Kim was born to an immigrant family in Dinuba, California, near Fresno. His family was not with abundant resources, but his parents loved art. His father enjoyed improvising poems, and his mother was a big fan of opera. And she is also an active person in helping the independence movement in South Korea. Earl Kim turned out to be very talented in piano playing, and therefore he received free lessons by American pianist Homer Grun. And then he went to UCLA studying composition with Arnold Schoenberg, which he paused to join the army as a combat intelligence officer. And that was during World War II. While doing so, he encountered the picture of the nuclear cloud in Nagasaki, Japan, where he actually just visited to see how it is and was deeply shocked by it. After the war, on the way back to his home, he visited Korea for a couple of days, and that was the first time and the last time for him as well. Back to the States, he went back to school, but to UC Berkeley this time, studying with another very famous composer, Ernst Bloch, and another one, Roger Sessions. And he stayed there as faculty and let go by the school because he refused to sign the loyalty oath. But he was invited to teach at Princeton University in 1952. And then later he became a faculty at Harvard in 1967, where he taught as James Edward Ditson Professor of Music. It's interesting to compare the timeline between these two composers. So when Earl Kim began teaching at Princeton, Lee Sang-yoon has never even moved to Europe. So he was even yet to begin emerging in the International Society of Contemporary Music Musicians. Earl Kim was the composer in residence at the Marlborough, Dartmouth, Aspen, and Tanglewood Festival, among many others. And he was awarded from the National Institute of Arts and Letters and from and Guggenheim Foundations, and Brandeis Creative Arts Medal, and Mark Howard from the Boston Symphony. He remained very active in politics, with co-founding Musicians Against the Nuclear Arms in 1981, serving as its first president for 4 years. When I did some interviews to get to know him a little more, his acquaintances or friends described me about him as a reserved person with respect to his personal character. And then I think you can see it through his music, in that he knows how to use silence in a very effective way. So yeah, every single note should have meaning or purpose in his music. He's also known for his admiration and eventually collaboration with mutual Samuel Beckett. And also he wrote lots of vocal music and theater music, but now let's listen to a piece by Earl Kim.
At the edge of the forest, dreams the girl with orange lips, knees crossed in the clear flood that gushes from the fields. Naked mist shaded, traversed and crawled by
So that was Earl Kim's piece, Girl with Orange Lips, from Where Grief Slumbers. And the text was an English translation of a poem by Arthur Rimbaud. And I think it shows how sensitive he is to the rhythm and intonation of the spoken language, even in not in original language that was written, and as well as the aforementioned effectiveness in using pauses, and of course the beautiful harmony. We will get back to Earl Kim on May 1st in more detail. And so far, to make it clear, there had been no interaction between Earl Kim and Lee Sang-hyun. Among all the composers I'm presenting today, probably the word pioneer would be best used to describe Namjoon Park. Well, he's now known much more as a video art or TV artist, but he began his artistic career as a composer / performer. When young, he studied composition with aforementioned Sehyung Kim, though no, actually Sunam Kim, who moved to North Korea later. Then Namjoon Pak studied in Hong Kong and later in Japan, where he wrote a thesis on Schoenberg. He moved to Germany in 1956 to study more composition and other art. And there he went also to the Darmstadt Festival, where he met Stockhausen and especially John Cage. And after that, he became an avant-garde performer, musician, joining Fluxus, an experimental art movement, or as they describe, attitude rather than movement. And to be more involved, Namjoon Pak moved to New York City in 1964, where he also began interested in video arts at the same time. And in 1967, Pak and cellist Charlotte Moorman performed his piece, Opera Sextronic, at the Filmmakers Cinematic in New York City. And Moorman was often naked and on, and the cops came to the stage and then bundled them into jail. So this is the picture of Moorman and Namjoon Pak performing not his piece, but Cage's piece. But I assume that is not very different. And when he became interested in TV arts, one of his pieces is a TV cello. And I think there is some consistency. And this is another famous piece, TV Buddha. And he became soon an international figure, doing lots of interesting installations. And one of the most ambitious one of his, or actually his lifetime, basically, is this satellite installation or show called Good Morning, Mr. Orwell. And that was performed on New Year's Day in 1984, as you can guess. And then this is an excerpt.
I may not be Big Brother, but I am watching you right here from my 1984 vantage point by Charlotte Moorman and her famous TV cello. You know, I don't think George Orwell would ever have envisioned such a thing as a TV cello. Tell me about it.
Well, Namjoon Pak did. It's nothing more than 3 television sets made into a cello. You can make one at home. He took the tubes out of the chassis, elongated the wires, and the controls are underneath me. He's made a TV Buddha. He's made a TV garden. He's made a TV chair, a TV pyramid, a TV bra.
A TV bra? What,
yes.
Little tiny Sony sets?
A brassiere of television sets.
And then this is a part where Charlotte Moorman actually featured in it, but that's just a part. There are lots of different shows or segments of shows where different artists and musicians joined, celebrating the New Year in 1984. Even when he was probably less engaged as a composer, he stayed still pretty influential in the contemporary music scene, and influential to especially those in Korea, interacting with his contemporary composers and musicians, including Seok Kang and Byung-gi Hwang. This is Seok Kang. Probably, I think it's proper to describe him as the bridge interacting with all the other composers I am presenting today. He was born in Seoul in 1934, as you can see. And firstly, he studied composition at the Seoul National University with aforementioned Seong Kim, who was the first president of Korean Composers Association. And soon he became, Saki Kang became interested in electronic music and released Korea's first electronic music titled Feast of Primary Colors. When Lee Sang-yoon was imprisoned in South Korea, Kang took the courage to just go there and visit him, saying he wants to study with him. And actually he got to meet him. And so he learned a little bit from Lee Sang-yoon back then, or he had some interaction with him. And afterward, he moved to Germany to study composition further, and in Hanover and in Berlin, both are places where Lee Sang-yoon taught, and actively still interacting with Lee Sang-yoon. So this is the picture of the teacher and the student. And remaining active as a composer worldwide, Saki Kang began teaching at his alma mater from 1982. And one of his first students is Eun-suk Chin, with whom I actually studied. And then that's one of many following students of his. Saki Kang won many prizes including those at the Paris Composer Festival, Grand Bell Award for Music, Daejong-sang, I understand, in Korean, the Korean Composition Award, among many others. He also composed the torch music for the closing ceremony of 1988 Olympics. So this is that part. You will hear trumpet first. And then so that's the electronic part, which was very advanced back then, especially. And then, of course, he did a whole lot of other things, but it is really, really hard to pick the most representative work. So I just chose most interesting one to me. And he launched a contemporary or modern music biennale in 1969, which renamed itself as Pan Music Festival, 밤음악제, and which remained still as one of the most active and primary music festivals, contemporary music festivals in South Korea. And also he hosted the ISCM, which stands for International Society of Contemporary Music, World Music Days. It's like an annual festival in Seoul in 1997. And he passed away last year. Though Lee Sang-yoon and Saki Kang also incorporated some Korean elements in his music, like a folk or Buddhist chant and different types of Korean traditional music in his own compositions. But they were not necessarily the performer of Korean music. And here comes Byung-gi Hwang, who is a gayageum master. A lot of you might have met him because he toured a lot, and then including venues like in Boston. And he's probably the first Korean composer who actually performed Korean folk instruments and who also combined Western music. I'm saying this because there had been a lot of other Korean composers just stayed in or not had not been exposed to Western music, but composed their own music. Byung-gi Hwang studied law first, and though he never ceased practicing 가야금, and he even won one of the biggest traditional Korean music competitions while he studied law. And he taught 가야금 after he graduated with law major at Seoul National University. And for those who are not familiar with the word 가야금, that's the instrument he's holding right now, and that's a plucked string instrument. And he taught at Seoul National University from 1959 through 63. And around at the same time, he began composing his original music. And afterwards, he explored various options of make a living because he was teaching part-time and there was not enough to support himself. But he didn't stop playing around the world. He was invited to play in Japan, Hawaii to begin with, and among many, many other places as a recitalist or soloist with orchestra. And he premiered one of the first pieces composed for Korean instruments by non-Korean people. That is 가야금 Concerto by Ellen Hovhaness. And then he finally got a position as a teaching position full-time at Ewha Women's University, teaching primarily in 가야금, but many other things. And not all of his music is extremely avant-garde or experimental, but this particular piece, which became really famous in South Korea, called Migung, meaning the labyrinth, was like a sensational and shocked a lot of people. To begin with, 가야금 is not supposed to be bold. The singer is, or the vocalist is reading a newspaper of the day. A lot of the piece is improvised, so it changes from time to time, whenever they actually play the piece. But I think you got the idea. And Byung-gi Hwang worked with many other composers, including, and then introduced lots of the Korean elements to lots of other composers. This is Byung-gi Hwang and this is Lee Sang-yeon. The second to left is Lee Sang-yeon and second to right is Byung-gi Hwang. And Byung-gi Hwang and Namjoon Park, and Namjoon Park's, as I understand, Namjoon Park's sister. And I think it's noteworthy that Byung-gi Hwang played in a concert to raise funds to help Namjoon Park when he was in jail for the premiere of Opera Sextronique. And that means they had been very close friends for a while before it. Byung-gi Hwang taught many performers who became much more open-minded to playing contemporary music or music by newly written by composers for Korean traditional instruments. But also he interacted with numerous composers in the next generation, including Jin-hee Kim, whom we had at the last session, and she stayed very close with Byung-gi Hwang, and Hyoshin Na, whom we will have the very next week, who wrote books on the interviews she conducted with Byung-gi Hwang. So far, still it may seem that Kim is rather isolated, right? We see Lee Sang-yeon with Byung-gi Hwang, Nam Jun-paek with Byung-gi Hwang with Seok Kang with Lee Sang-yeon, yada. The link of his to these other composers, I mean of Kim, is not composer himself. He had some interaction with other composers, but primarily it was through the performers who brought his music all over the world, and also his student, Donald Sir. Donald Sir is going to be the last composer I'm going to talk about among the first generation. And Donald Sir, just like Kim, he was born in the States to a Korean immigrant family. As a matter of fact, those who immigrated as the very first ones in 1902. And they moved, he was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, but they moved to California, and eventually Donald settled in LA. And just like Kim, again, Donald studied at UCLA and UC Berkeley, but his interest was more in ethnomusic college. He studied Balinese music, and so it was very natural for him to grow his interest in Korean traditional music. So following his postgraduate studies at Princeton with Roger Sessions and Kim, he earned grants to study in South Korea for 4 years from 1964 through 68. And basically studying Korean court music and other Korean folk music. And he joined Seok Kang to build an energetic contemporary music scene in Seoul, and including his activity of having a recital of his own music at the National Theater of Korea in 1967. And it is also told that Donald introduced Earl and Saki. So there is a saying that Earl Kim invited Saki to study in the States as well, but Seok Kang went to Europe instead. Donald came back to the States, landing in Boston to pursue his doctorate at Harvard, where was teaching. And they remained very close friends eventually until the death of Donald Sir. And Donald contributed much to the new music scene in Boston and New England, and as well as South Korea. He taught at MIT, Harvard, Tufts, and many other schools, and got his music performed by numerous ensembles in Boston, including Collage New Music. His music is often described as eclectic, so it's also very hard for me to choose a representative of his piece. So I'm just going to play my own favorite, which I already played in the beginning of the lecture, titled Satori on Park Avenue. Okay, I think that's good enough to get the gist of this piece, maybe not Donald Sir, but this piece. And when I interviewed some of his close collaborators, including David Hughes, they mentioned the unpredictability in his music is a very interesting quality and his sense of timing. We will also get back to Donald Sir on May 1st, along with Kim. And we will also discuss this particular larger scale oratorio in two parts titled Slavery Documents, written for 80 voices, 80 voice choirs, half of them being African American, and 5 soloists and an orchestra with the organ part. Okay, so now researching these composers, and then because I became interested when I came to the States, what other composers of Korean heritage were doing, and I found that's fascinating. I began more and more indulging myself in collecting the information, but it's a vast amount of information, and I just began to think how to organize that and what are the factors. And to me, of course, genealogy is important. Who studied with whom, or who had a good rapport with which other composers, and that's important. For example, Kim had Donald Sir, but Donald Sir does not seem to have a lot of other students of the Korean heritage, and neither did Kim, except for Donald Sir. And Nam Jun Pak did not really teach composition, and Byung-gi Hwang mostly taught performances. So mostly the biggest family or studio grown is those by Lee Sang-hyun and Seok Hee-kang. So Lee Sang-hyun had some other Korean students who also settled in South Korea, including Byung-dong Pak. And also there are more composers who didn't really have any specific teacher-student relationship with these composers either. So it's a big family, but there are some traceable genealogy if you would love to. And the keyword would be, of course, use of Korean traditional music. It could be ceremonial or court music or folk music. And how to embrace Korean music is also diverse among these different composers. And probably if I had to say it the other way, the opposite, polar opposite would be looking for or searching for cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitan quality. And just because they are so fluent in non-Korean music, or it might have been intentional for them to just with some pressure that they had to be a part of this a larger community of contemporary musicians worldwide. And from seeing Namjoon Park and Seok Kang interested in multimedia and electronic music, I still see the strength of composers. Of course, multimedia is just a big trend, one of the big trends in contemporary music in general, but I also see lots of Korean composers contributing in that field. So again, use of Korean music and heritage. Performers like Byung-gi Hwang and Jinny Kim, who also plays Come Go. And we also had Gamin. Gamin mostly performs, but she also improvises. And there are a later generation of performer composers with a lot more educational background now. Suyeon Lee and Jonghyun Ju play hagam, the bowed string instruments. And Doyeon Kim, who is in Boston or related to Boston closely and plays kayakum as well, and many more. Tara Han, I heard a name as well. And of course, there are some other performer composers that do not necessarily play Korean instruments. But I think because there are relatively smaller body of repertoires for Korean instrumentalists, they just looked for creating them by themselves. I think it was a natural bottom line for them. And among those who perform, who are performer composers, include Avind Kang, who teaches at Cal Arts, and Bora Yoon. I just saw on Instagram a couple days ago or yesterday that she is premiering or performing her piece called Pansori Chansori. Pansori is a Korean music form, like a Korean epic saga performed by one person, and Chansori is meddling, and that's kind of rhyming. And Bora Yoon plays lots of other things, but also she actively incorporates some Korean elements in her music. And some Korean musicians who just came to the States to study also developed their interest in conducting. All of them are also active as composers, but Moon Young-ha in New York City, Elliot Bark in LA, and Jae-hyuk Choi, who studied in Boston when he was young and moved to New York and currently active in Europe, as I understand, are performing composers, but not necessarily performing Korean music. And there are composers who are not necessarily a performer of Korean instruments, but highly influenced by Korean heritage. For example, Youngi Park Pan, she's probably one of them that are not necessarily in the States, but she's beginning to have her music performed in the States as well, but she is also a very influential teacher of composition in Germany. And Younghee Pakpan embraces Korean philosophy seriously in her music. And we had Ji-young Kim in last season, who composed lots of other things, but also she extensively studied Korean music. And Paul Yun Lee, who was also the composer in residence of Korean Symphony Orchestra, and who incorporates lots of Korean instruments and Korean elements in his music as well. And that is the connecting point. We can invite non-Korean composers. So we met Donald Womack, who teaches at University of Hawaii. And also University of Hawaii also has Thomas Osborne, who is as active in writing for Korean instruments. And Jen Shu, we had Jen Shu last season. She embraces a lot of different folk music, among which Korean music takes a significant part. And we will invite Michael Sidney Timpson and Chi-chan Chi-sun Lee couple on April 24th. And they currently reside in South Korea. There had been some other composers who lived in South Korea, but I think having them would provide us some insights about the reverse side, basically like the opposite side, how it would be like to be a composer in Korea as a non-Korean composer. And I talked about cosmopolitanism, and lots of Korean composers in the States fall into this particular category because it's really, really broad. But Hee-kyung Kim, I really, really wanted to invite her, Hee-kyung Kim, but she has a schedule conflict, so she was not able to join us, who teaches at UC Santa Cruz. She has a very interesting interview with some newspaper in South Korea as a Korean person who just happened to immigrated to the States. She studied composition in Korea first. And then in the States, she dealt with being from a different country. And then she had a chance to study in France at IRCAM, presenting her music, and she got the comments that your music is so American. And then that brought her some identity crisis as, okay, I was Korean, I became American, now I am what? That kind of issues. And Eun-suk Chin, her music is also known for a very global, universal language. And Kay Ree, we will also have her on April 17th. She incorporates diverse influences in her music. And among we already had Jurisa and Jin An, Yoonji Lee show some interesting interaction between, or like a fluency in Western music with some other elements for sure. For example, Jinan uses Korean melody a lot, but her style and her skills are based on Western contemporary music very much. And there are a lot more. Caroline Chung-An, who teaches at Anderson University, James Ra, Sobong Kim, I can't really enumerate all of them. Some interesting category I just added is the composers who went to Europe first or stayed in Europe for a while and then settled back in the States, including Song Ji-hong and Song-hae Kim. Jurisa studied in Italy for a year. And actually, just sideway, I was interested by the parallel between Kim and Jurisa. Both of them mentioned in an interview of how much they value the tradition, because cosmopolitan languages could be very avant-garde, but at the same time, very conservative music. but both Erkim and Jurisa mentioned their love for more traditional elements in music, like a counterpoint and harmony. And Chaeuk Choi is the other case who studied in the States first, and then now become more active in Europe. At this point, I'd love to listen to just a music as an example of what they write. And this is a piece by Song Ji-hong. She lived in Greece for a substantial time, and she's now in Denton, Texas, teaching at University of North Texas. And this particular piece, well, the title is in Greek, Agonia, and it has significant, I chose the piece with the suggestion of composer herself, and because it's very timely in that it's about the passion of Jesus Christ. To me, Song Ji-hong and other composers, but Song Ji-hong particularly, seem to be very fluent in avant-garde music idiom. And also, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I chose her piece here today, among others. And speaking of cosmopolitanism, I think it's important for us to pay attention to 1.5 or the second generation of Koreans here. So there are Paul Yun Lee, K. Ri, as I understand, who came to the States very at early age. And Avid Kang, Nikki Son, Peter Shin. Peter Shin is, I think, the second generation, and Jung Yun Wee. All these younger generations coming up could come up with a different experiences as Asian American in the States from their young ages, which may not affect to their music, but I think there might be some elements we can find. And also, I am also interested in composers of Korean heritage, partially. For example, Jennifer Jolie is a half Korean who teaches at Texas Tech University. And Lilia Ukai is a quarter Korean, and she is physically from Uzbekistan, but she is now teaching at Florida State University with Jihye Chang, one of the guest artists we had in our first season. And again, electronic and multimedia, that's kind of the tradition from Namjoon Park and Saki Kang. And we had the privilege to have Juwon Park as a guest here, and Jinhee Kim also incorporate some technology. And Yoonji Lee, who does a lot of other things, among which electronic music is included. And Taeyong Park, who teaches multimedia and technology at NYU, New York University. And Kyungmi Choi, who teaches at Roosevelt University. Also, she is very active as composer in diverse genres, but including electronic music. And I would love to introduce one piece. This is probably the last piece we are going to listen to today, titled Vanish It, for harp and electronics. For the sake of our time, probably we will stop listening to this piece now and here. So this is the last slide. So now I can invite some questions. And before we move on to questions, I would love to thank those who actually met with me to give a lot of information, including musicologist Hee-kyung Lee in South Korea and music columnist Anna Rowe, No-seung Lim, and also lots of musicians in Boston area, including John Harbison, Mark Devoto, and David Hughes and Paul Salieri, and also Kim's wife, Martha Potter Kim, offered lots of information about Earl, Kim, and Donna Sir and their music. I really, really appreciate all of them for helping me out. And we will bring some of them in our last session to discuss in more in depth about the music by those two composers. And again, I feel really bad because as you can tell, I just have so many composers I know, and I can't introduce just like a 100 of them. And most of them I happen to know in person, and that's probably why unfairly they were introduced first. But I would love to just expand, and then I would love to encourage others to just pay attention to these wonderful musicians and artists. And I think there are lots of things to be discovered here. And so we have some questions on Zoom chat and Facebook. Okay, thank you for kind messages. I'm not going to read them. Dr. Byung Kim asked, the diversity of Korea-related composers is amazing. I agree. Is there similar diverse array of Japanese composers? And do you expect emerging array of Chinese composers? That's a very interesting question. As I know, I mean, the few Chinese composers I know, and or composers with some sort of Chinese heritage, already range like a widely, like they're so different from one another. So it is happening already. And, considering the population of Chinese and Chinese American people, it shouldn't be surprising that they spend a whole lot of, they spend a very large range of aesthetics, and with relation to their relationship with a Chinese tradition as well, I assume. Well, and then I know, and also there are lots of composers who are doing interesting stuff like a music theater, and lots of opera composers who are active in the States, like Zhao Long and Du Yun, who both of whom won Pulitzer, I think. And so with their operas. And there are multimedia composers for sure. And also there are lots of Chinese composers in mainland China as well. So yes, I would say yes for Chinese composers, and that's happening already. And they also have a stronger, to me, one of the motivation I began this project was I was aware of some ancestry in China among Chinese composers, like when Chuan Chang came to the States and he began teaching at Columbia University, and there were some students of his who studied at Columbia University who became the second generation of very influential composers in the States. And I was curious if I can trace such a thing among Korean composers. Actually, that was, so the order is the other way around to me. Japanese composers, I'm afraid that, I know some of them, but I wouldn't say I know enough of them among to say as a scholarly, in a scholarly manner, with confidence that I know the range of them, but I assume so.
Texo, you are muted.
Yes, sorry. So I am seeing the comments on Facebook, and I found lots of encouraging comments, and especially from a friend of mine, SG No. Thank you. And but it's mostly just comments, not a question. Oh, there is one question. What do you and how do you make well mixed sound of Western with Korean instruments as the view of sound? That's an interesting question, and that's an ongoing topic among composers who try to combine Western instruments and Korean instruments as well, because it's still, the research is on its emerging state, I think. Among Korean instruments, between different Korean instruments, the balance is really tricky. Some of that is because the Korean instruments are, some of them are standardized, but some of them are not. So even the same instruments have different loudness and balance and timbre. So it is really, really hard to give a general answer. But now we have some general idea about which instruments become louder in which register, for example, and which timbre is similar. For example, to me, a mixture of English horn and muted trombone sounds similar to a low Piri sound. Like that kind of accumulated experiences are being collected, I think, among Korean. And there are researches of the spectrum of the sound of Korean instruments now in Korea. So you can apply those into the spectralism in, it's a movement slash style emerged from France, but it's also still very popular and strong worldwide. Could you tell us a little about your music in light of Korean heritage? Sure, yeah, why not? So the way I interact with Korean heritage is not necessarily incorporating Korean traditional music, because I grew up with some familiarity with some Korean music, but not the authentic Korean music, like a court music. I learned a little bit of Korean folk music, but the music I was surrounded by was more pop music, like global pop music. Korea K-pop was highly globalized, but so I incorporated a sound I encountered when I was young that I think as uniquely Korean, like some folk songs, chants of street vendors, and also Korean Christianity is a gem in terms of observing the interaction between Korean indigenous culture and Western influence. So, for example, they have this revival meeting, which was very common when I was young, and there they do this type of prayer with some speak in tongue, and the music ranged from just really like a contemporary Christian music, like pop music, and also some resemblance of Korean shaman music. So I thought it was very interesting, and then that's a unique combination of Korean heritage and Western music. And there are lots of those snippets. I would love to just take those nuances in my music. And I see a lot of more potential that I would love to share with my contemporary Korean composers. And I'm not the pioneer. It's also a big part of just artistic movements that pay attention to modern Korea. I thought I was the only one, but there were a lot of others actually independently became interested in the same type of activity, and not only in music, but in creating films and writings and visual arts. Okay. Do we have any other question on Facebook? I guess no. So, well, and then it's what time is it? 8:23. So it's a good. I think it's a good time for us to say goodbye for this week. And I am relieved now that I'm done with this lecture. Oh no, there is another question. Yes, okay, but I will answer this question. Dr. Byung Kim asks, as a music educator as well as a composer, do you think Korean traditional music should be taught in Korean primary or middle schools? I believe they are taught. It's just, and then they're a little more integrated. And I am really, really hopeful about what's going on in South Korea, because there is this new wave of Korean traditional musicians who became familiar and fluent with Western music, and then they create very interesting music incorporating both cultures in mainland Korea. And some of them, I think, tour in the States, like Inalchi, Akdan Gwangchi, and Sing Sing Band, which is dismissed now, unfortunately. Those the new generation of like Korean musicians are amazing. And Won Il, I think is also really, really important figure. And then he succeeded in a way Byung-gi Hwang, and then he was the music director of the what was the recent Olympics, right? I'm blanking. Can anyone help me with this? Yeah. Was it Pyeongchang? I think so. Yes.
평창.
Yes.
평창.
Yeah. Right. Pyeongchang Winter Olympics.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, like trot music in South Korea, Korean traditional music becomes a hip thing, trend culture now. So I think a lot of young cultured or young, those who are interested in culture and music would be very familiar with some sort of Korean elements. And to me, that was Sapyeonje, a film. Like multimedia and pop culture does a lot of things. Did I answer the question properly? Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, hosting me for hosting me to KCSB and Korean Consul General of Boston. And everyone, stay safe and stay musical, and I will see you next week with Hyoshin Na.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.